Morning booktube. Welcome back to Traumatic Tomes. This is a Saturday in early June, June 7th. It seems like it's dark out this morning, but the sky is blue. I guess there are more clouds than I can see out of my window, for it is a bit dim. The lighting is not so bright in my apartment. But I come to you on this Saturday morning in June with an 1800s book review. As you can probably guess by the title of this video, we got Sherlock Holmes. This is A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle, written in 1887. Arthur Conan Doyle was a Scottish-born English/Irish guy. He was British Isles. His nationality is kind of hard to pin down, but basically Britishish. And I don't think I have to explain the Sherlock Holmes story to any of you. Master sleuth, detective, just crazy man, genius, inventor, drug addict or drug user, just like the craziest, most prescient genius you can imagine. I'm sure most of you have seen film or screen adaptations of Sherlock. Modern times with Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch, or in more old times, I think Basil Rathbone has a lot of movies. So yeah, first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet. I really enjoyed this. At least the first part of this book is excellent. Now, we'll get into the second part later. That is a whole different story. I've seen it heavily criticized online. I didn't think the second part was that bad, but it is a jarring difference from the first half of the novel. So we'll get to that later. But talking about the first part only, the first part, I don't know if it has a name. The first part Part 1 being a reprint from the reminiscences of John H. Watson, MD, late of the Army Medical Department. So this is about the first Sherlock Holmes mystery, but first it introduces John Watson, our narrator, and then it goes into the meeting between Watson and Holmes, and then it goes into a case that Sherlock takes upon, and he takes along John Watson, who records these adventures. So first, talking about John Watson, he's basically a shell-shocked and injured war veteran of, is it the Second Anglo-Afghan War? I can't remember the exact war, but he was fighting he was a doctor for the British in a war in Afghanistan, and he was injured, and he's been sent back to London to convalesce or recuperate. And he was kind of being a drifter for a while, but he decided he was spending too much money, and now he needs to save money and get a roommate. But times being how they are, it was tough to get a roommate. So John Watson meets up with his old pal, I forget his name, Stamford maybe, and his pal says, "Hey, I have a roommate." "No, I don't have a roommate. I know of somebody looking for a roommate, but be careful because he is totally batty. He's nuts." And Watson kind of overlooks that. He's like, he's probably fine, like whatever. So Watson goes to this laboratory, this hospital laboratory, to meet Holmes. And there's a famous encounter that happens there where as soon as Holmes shakes Watson's hand, he says, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." He's not asking a question. He's telling Watson that Holmes knows that Watson was in Afghanistan without any prior knowledge of Watson or never having seen him before. So that is the definitive introduction to Sherlock, which I think is so awesome. And that you go down into this like basement laboratory, and there's this man feverishly working at some experiment, and you can just imagine him alone in a basement, like cackling. And as soon as Watson comes down to meet him, Sherlock kind of perks up as well, because he does like to have an audience and he likes to perform a little. So that is just a great introduction to one of the most iconic characters ever in Sherlock Holmes. And that one, you see that he's a crazy man. Two, you understand that he is especially skilled in the powers of analysis and deduction, that's his bread and butter. That's what the Sherlock Holmes stories are all about. The powers of deduction in the mind and analyzing evidence and not using force, using the brain. So just for that alone, an awesome read. At one point, Watson mentions that Holmes reminds him of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. Dupin. I'm not sure how to say that, but I've read Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which featured Dupin as this primitive detective, not primitive, but like one of the earliest like modern detectives in literature. And Dupin uses also powers of deduction to solve this case of some ferocious murders, I think in Paris. I really liked the story of Murders in the Rue Morgue. I thought it was good for Poe's time, but I do see there being differences between Holmes and Dupin, and the Dupin kind of felt like a know-it-all prick. Not that I read this last year, so I'm a little fuzzy on it. I haven't returned to it yet because I don't own it. But Dupin felt like he was just toying with his friend who was narrating the thing. He was aloof. He was above his friend in intellect, and he knew it. And it was all just kind of like a game solving this murder. But for Sherlock Holmes, I think he's just a little too crazy to have this air of like superiority. Like maybe he knows that he's smarter than Watson, but he's all about the game being afoot, and he's really into this not for showing off, but for the thrill of the hunt, I think. Although Sherlock is a little butthurt that the police always take credit for his work, so he does want to show off. So it's maybe him and Dupin are similar. But yeah, the actual detective story, I don't know what precedes Holmes in detective fiction other than Murders in Rue Morgue. I think Wilkie Collins and Dickens perhaps have some detective elements, and I'm sure there's a lot of other novels that aren't as famous today. But the story was gripping. The science, or not the science, but like the facts of the case. You have a man who was possibly murdered, but you don't know how it happened. There's some trails of candy, Easter eggs. I don't know can't think of how to say that right now. But yeah, the detective story was good. And what I loved is I didn't know this actually came from Holmes, but it makes sense. And page 45, I think, Watson walks into the room and Holmes looks up and he says, "The plot thickens," which is one of the greatest lines ever, I think. It's used quite often in modern times still. I assume Conan Doyle didn't copy that from someone else. I assume he just wrote it. But yeah, that was great. So yeah, my comments on part two of this book. Part two is a very strange way to finish out a book. It is the backstory of one of the characters involved in the plot, the murder plot. And it takes place in America, mostly in Utah with the Mormons. And I'll agree that not a very necessary thing to do for Conan Doyle to have half of the book. Let's see. Yeah, like basically half of the book be about the backstory of one of the characters that's not Holmes or Watson. And there's this big journey through Utah and whatever. I enjoyed reading it, but it was clearly a step below Holmes and Watson content. And it definitely takes away from the reading of the novel as a whole. So I can't rate it that highly as a result. But still, I really enjoyed this book. I love Sherlock Holmes. I love detective fiction. I don't read as much of it as I might like because I don't want to devote as much time to detectives. But yeah, this was definitely worth a read, and I would like to read more Sherlock Holmes in the future. Like to read more Doyle in the future. I know he's got some other works besides Holmes. And he actually, I don't think he liked Sherlock Holmes very much, but it was his moneymaker, so he had to keep writing it well, he didn't have to, but he was compelled by forces to keep writing. So, yeah, if you haven't read any Sherlock books, A Study in Scarlet is great to start out with because it goes through the meeting of Holmes and Watson, and it's their inaugural mystery. Be wary of part two, as it is not in London. It doesn't really have anything to do with the Sherlock, but yeah, still worth a read. Study in Scarlet, Arthur Conan Doyle. Check it out. See you later.